A knock came at the door of a small row house outside Pittsburgh on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 1953, and the moment Bernice Voss saw the foreman's face standing on her porch instead of her husband's, she already knew something in her life had just ended before a single word was spoken. Joseph had gone to work that morning the same way he had for 11 straight years, and he was never coming home again. What nobody tells you about a moment like that is what comes after it, not the grief itself, but the arithmetic. Bernice had 4 children under the age of 13, a landlord expecting rent in 9 days, and exactly $20 standing between her family and a month she had no idea how she was going to survive. This is the story of how she did it, one impossible decision at a time. If stories about real resilience matter to you, subscribe now, because what Bernice built out of $20 still holds lessons worth learning today. The funeral itself took almost nothing, arranged quickly and modestly through the same parish that had baptized all 4 of her children, and by the time the last of the neighbors had left her small kitchen that first week, Bernice sat alone at the table, with an insurance claim that hadn't been processed yet, a mill that had already stopped issuing Joseph's pay, and a tin on the counter holding exactly $20, money she and Joseph had been slowly setting aside toward a used icebox they'd never get to buy now. That $20 wasn't a paycheck, it wasn't a gift, it was simply what existed, and it had to last until the insurance company finished whatever it was they needed to finish, a process nobody could tell her would take 2 weeks or 2 months. Her oldest, Thomas, was 12 that year, old enough to understand exactly what had happened, and old enough to notice his mother counting coins at the kitchen table late into the night after the younger 3 were finally asleep. Alice was 9. Quiet and watchful in the way children get when a house suddenly feels different, without anyone explaining why. Daniel was 6, still young enough to ask when his father was coming home, a question Bernice answered as gently and as honestly as she knew how, over and over for weeks. And the baby, June, not yet a year old, needed things a grieving mother had almost no room left inside her to think clearly about: formula, diapers, a crib that Joseph had built with his own hands the winter before. Bernice did the only thing that made any sense to her that first terrible week. She sat down with a pencil and divided that $20 before a single cent of it disappeared into anything at all. Rent, due on the 15th, would need $8, an amount she had already discussed with her landlord, a decent man named Mr. Halloran, who had known Joseph for years, and agreed, without much convincing, to accept a partial payment that month, with the rest to follow once the insurance settled. That left $12 for 4 children and herself, for an entire month, and Bernice understood immediately that groceries alone could easily consume every remaining cent if she wasn't careful about every single decision from that point forward. But knowing where the money needed to go was only the beginning. The real question was how anything at all was going to stretch far enough to cover it. The first thing Bernice did, before the funeral flowers had even fully wilted on the windowsill, was walk 2 blocks to Mrs. Kowalczyk's grocery, a small corner store that had extended credit to half the families in that neighborhood at one point or another. She didn't ask for charity. She asked for flour, dried beans, a sack of potatoes, powdered milk, and whatever cuts of meat cost the least that week, explaining plainly what had happened and what she could actually afford to pay that day. Mrs. Kowalczyk, who had buried her own husband 6 years earlier in a similar mill accident 2 streets over, didn't say much. She simply weighed out a little extra flour than Bernice had paid for and told her to come back when she needed more. This is where the story becomes less about one woman's individual strength and more about something considerably larger operating quietly underneath an entire neighborhood. Widows in that era, in towns built entirely around a single mill or factory, weren't unusual, and the women who had already survived that same loss tended to recognize exactly what a new widow needed before she even had the words to ask for it. A jar of preserves left wordlessly on the porch, a bag of hand-me-down clothes for Daniel, whose own were already showing their wear, an offer to watch June for a few hours so Bernice could think clearly, even for a moment, without a baby on her hip. None of this solved the underlying math. Bernice still had $12, 4 children, and roughly 30 days standing between her and whatever came next. But it meant the $12 didn't have to cover everything entirely on its own, and that difference mattered more than it might seem to from a distance. Every meal that month was planned before it was cooked, not out of any particular discipline Bernice had cultivated beforehand, but because there was genuinely no room left for guessing wrong. Beans, stretched with whatever vegetables were cheapest that week, appeared at the table more nights than not, thickened into something closer to a stew when a small piece of ham bone, purchased for almost nothing from the butcher's discard bin, could be added for flavor. Bread, baked at home rather than bought, cost considerably less than anything from a bakery, and Bernice learned to make it stretch across breakfast, lunch, and dinner in whatever form the day's ingredients allowed. Potatoes appeared constantly, boiled, fried, mashed, however many different ways a single sack could be reasonably transformed before the children grew tired of them entirely. There was one afternoon, roughly 10 days into that first terrible month, when Bernice opened the pantry and found considerably less than she'd believed was there, a miscalculation that meant Thursday's dinner would need to come from almost nothing at all. She has told her own grandchildren, decades later, about standing in that kitchen with a half sack of flour, 3 eggs, and a small jar of drippings, genuinely unsure whether she could make that stretch across 5 people. She did, in the end, a simple dumpling soup that her children still remember fondly, not because it was especially good, but because it was the meal that taught all 4 of them, without anyone saying it directly, exactly how thin things had actually gotten. Rent came due on the 15th, and Bernice walked the $8 over to Mr. Halloran herself, along with a promise about the remainder once the insurance claim finally cleared. He accepted it without complaint, though Bernice would learn years later, quite by accident, that he had quietly told his own wife that month that he wasn't especially worried about collecting the rest, whenever it came, from a woman he trusted completely to eventually make good on it. But the real crisis of that month wasn't rent, and it wasn't groceries either. It arrived on a Tuesday, roughly 3 weeks in, when Daniel woke up burning with fever, and Bernice found herself facing a decision that had nothing to do with careful budgeting at all. A doctor's visit cost money Bernice genuinely did not have room for that particular week, not without pulling directly from whatever remained for food. She sat with Daniel through that first night, cooling his forehead with a damp cloth, praying it would break on its own by morning, the way childhood fevers often did. It didn't. By the second day, with Daniel listless and increasingly difficult to wake fully, Bernice made the only decision a mother in her position reasonably could. She walked the 6 blocks to the parish rectory and asked Father Dombrowski, plainly and without much pride left to protect, whether the church's small emergency fund, set aside specifically for families in exactly this kind of situation, could cover a doctor's visit for her son. It could, and it did, and the doctor who came that same afternoon diagnosed a bad case of influenza, serious but treatable, requiring rest, fluids, and a medicine that cost considerably less than Bernice had feared it might. Daniel recovered within the week, though Bernice has said in the years since that those 3 days remain some of the most frightening of her entire life, considerably more frightening in the moment than the funeral itself had been, because grief, however devastating, had at least already happened. A sick child with no clear way to pay for help was still an open question, one she genuinely didn't know the answer to until Father Dombrowski gave her one. This is worth sitting with for a moment because it reveals something important about how families in Bernice's position actually survived months like this one. It wasn't purely through individual frugality, however real and however necessary that frugality was. It was through a network, a parish, a neighbor, a grocer, a landlord, each one absorbing a small piece of a burden that no single person, however capable, could have carried entirely alone. There was still one more crisis waiting before that month was finished, and it arrived, as these things so often do, from a direction Bernice hadn't been watching closely enough. The coal bin behind the house, which Joseph had always kept filled through the coldest stretch of March without her ever needing to think about it, had quietly run down to almost nothing by the 3rd week, and a hard frost that year lingered considerably longer than usual. Bernice discovered the shortage on a Sunday evening, checking the bin herself for the first time in her married life and finding barely enough left to last 2 more nights. She could have spent money she genuinely didn't have on an emergency delivery, money that would have come directly out of whatever remained for food that week. Instead, she did what she had watched other widows on that same street quietly do before her. She sent Thomas, bundled against the cold, to walk the alley behind the mill, where scrap wood and coal fragments sometimes fell from delivery wagons, a practice half frowned upon and half tolerated by everyone who understood exactly why a boy might be doing it. He came home twice that week with a sack over his shoulder, enough, combined with careful rationing of what little coal remained, to keep the house tolerably warm until the insurance settlement finally arrived and a proper delivery could be paid for outright. Bernice never asked him to stop going, and she never quite brought herself to thank him for it directly either, though she kept that particular memory close for the rest of her life. The insurance settlement finally arrived in the 4th week of that month, considerably later than Bernice had hoped, but not so late that it hadn't mattered enormously by the time it came. It wasn't a fortune, nowhere close to what Joseph would have earned across the years he should have had left to work, but it was enough to cover the remaining rent owed to Mr. Halloran, replenish the pantry properly for the first time in weeks, and leave a small remainder that Bernice, almost without thinking about it, immediately set aside rather than spent, a habit that would define the rest of her life from that point forward. But the settlement alone was never going to sustain 4 children indefinitely, and Bernice understood this clearly, even in the relief of finally having it in hand. She needed steady income, something beyond a single payout that would eventually run out no matter how carefully she managed it. And so, in that same 4th week, while still managing a household running almost entirely on beans, bread, and borrowed grace, Bernice began doing something she'd quietly been considering since almost the very first week of her widowhood. She hung a small hand-lettered sign in Mrs. Kowalczyk's store window, offering mending and alterations for anyone in the neighborhood willing to pay a fair price for careful work. Bernice had always been skilled with a needle, the kind of quiet skill nobody particularly notices until it's needed, and within 2 weeks she had 4 steady customers, women from the neighborhood bringing torn work shirts, hemlines that needed adjusting, a wedding dress that required careful alteration for a niece getting married that spring. It wasn't much money individually, a few coins here, a dollar there, but it was steady in a way that $20 sitting in a tin could never be. And steady, Bernice had learned in the hardest possible way, mattered considerably more than any single lump sum ever could. There was also the matter of Alice's shoes, which had been pinching for weeks before anyone had the money or the attention to properly address it, everything else in that household having taken priority over a 9-year-old's quiet discomfort. Bernice noticed it finally on a Sunday morning, watching Alice limp slightly on the walk to church, and understood immediately that this particular problem couldn't simply wait for the settlement to clear. She did something that cost her more pride than money that week, walking to the back room of her own closet and pulling out a hat she had barely worn twice, a wedding gift from an aunt who had since passed, and traded it directly with a neighbor 2 doors down for a pair of barely worn shoes her own daughter had already outgrown. Alice never knew the full story behind those shoes until she was well into adulthood herself, only that they had appeared, almost like magic, the very same week her old ones had become unbearable. By the end of that first devastating month, the one that had begun with a knock on the door and $20 standing between her family and disaster, Bernice Voss had not simply survived, she had built, out of almost nothing, the earliest version of a small business that would eventually support her family for years to come, doing mending and alterations for half the neighborhood, work that grew steadily as her reputation for careful, honest craftsmanship spread from one household to the next. None of this happened because Bernice was extraordinary in some way most people aren't. She would have told you herself, if you'd asked her, that she was simply doing what any mother in her position would have done, one difficult day at a time, without much room to consider any alternative. But there's something in her story worth remembering regardless, a pattern that repeated itself in households across the country during that era, whenever hardship arrived without warning. Every single dollar had a specific job before it was spent. Every relationship, with a grocer, a landlord, a priest, a neighbor, represented a form of security that no bank account alone could ever fully replace. And every skill Bernice already possessed, however unremarkable it seemed to her at the time, eventually became the foundation of something that carried her family considerably further than $20 ever could have on its own. It's worth pausing here to consider how differently this same month might have unfolded for a woman without those particular relationships already in place, without a grocer who remembered her husband fondly, without a landlord willing to extend trust, without a parish that had quietly set aside money for exactly this kind of emergency. Bernice herself understood this clearly, and in the decades that followed, she became one of those same women for other widows in her own neighborhood, extending the same quiet grace to a young mother 2 streets over who lost her own husband in a similar accident nearly 15 years later. The kindness that had carried Bernice through her darkest month became, eventually, a kindness she was able to pass forward herself, completing a circle that had started with a knock on her own door back in 1953.
Thomas, Alice, Daniel, and June all grew up in that same small row house, raised almost entirely on their mother's mending income, supplemented by whatever the garden produced each summer, and whatever small kindnesses continued arriving from a neighborhood that never fully stopped watching out for them. Thomas went on to work at the very same mill that had taken his father, a decision Bernice never tried to talk him out of, understanding perhaps better than anyone that some things simply run in a family, regardless of what happened before. Alice became a teacher. Daniel, the boy who had nearly succumbed to fever in that terrifying 3rd week, grew into a man who kept his own mother's mending needle in a small box on his dresser for the rest of his life, a reminder, he always said, of exactly what that needle had once helped hold together. Bernice herself never remarried, though she was asked more than once over the following decade. She ran her small mending business well into her 60s, eventually training her own granddaughter in the same careful stitches Bernice's own mother had taught her decades earlier in a country neither of them had been born in. When she passed away in the early 1990s, her family found, tucked into the same tin that had once held $20 desperate in the spring of 1953, a considerably larger sum, built slowly and steadily across nearly 40 years of a life that had started in its darkest month with almost nothing at all standing between her family and genuine catastrophe.
What Bernice's story teaches, stripped entirely of the specific decade and the specific hardship that shaped it, isn't really about how little a person can survive on, though survival itself is certainly part of it. It's about what happens when every single resource available to a person, money, skill, relationship, and community, gets pointed toward the exact same goal at the exact same time. $20 alone would never have carried Bernice Voss through that month. What carried her was $20 combined with a grocer willing to extend credit, a landlord willing to wait, a priest willing to help, a neighborhood willing to notice, and a mother willing to do absolutely everything within her power for 4 children who had no one else left to depend on. Bernice Voss never once described herself as brave, though everyone who knew her insisted otherwise for the rest of her life. She simply believed there was no version of that terrible month where giving up was actually an option available to her, not with 4 children depending entirely on whatever she managed to figure out next. $20 on its own was never going to be enough. What was enough, in the end, was everything Bernice built around it: the credit extended in good faith, the fever that finally broke, the needle that never stopped moving, and a mother who simply refused to let an impossible month become an impossible life. Her family still tells this story today, not as a tragedy, but as proof of exactly what one determined woman could build from almost nothing at all. If Bernice's story moved you the way it moved us, subscribe now, because we bring a true story of real resilience like this one every single week. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done differently in her position, and which part of her story affected you the most? We read every single response.